understand that you're an RA for the fourth floor.
Yes.
Now, as a resident assistant, have you seen any current racial discrimination?
Not so much seen it, but it definitely exists with the whole feeding into stereotypes. It's just a joking thing that people don't realize that it definitely hits like beyond surface level.
They take it too far and they don't understand the ramifications associated with it.
Yes, what may seem as a joke to some is a whole different reality to some other people.
Now, do you think that we've still came a long way since the days of Martin Luther King Jr.?
Yes, but now it's going through a technological shift to where it's being accepted on social media as just a joke and a playful thing that is actually quite scary to me.
One thing that irritates me is a lot of Caucasians will say Black History Month is a thing. How come there's no White History Month? But if you really think about it, the other 11 months are all White History Months. Don't you think so?
I would say so, yes. I mean, there's significant dates for everything, and I don't think we should really characterize on one, but just it's very broad. White History Month, that would just be like labeling it to just say, just rub it in the face of all these other months that have a name after it.
So how do you think Siena does with racism on campus?
Racism on campus, I've seen a couple events where it could be considered a hate crime, whether that was the fact or not, with various incidents. Dang. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about that. Probably shouldn't. Just disregard that. Could we go with that question again?
Yeah.
What was it again?
Okay. How do you think Siena does with racial discrimination? Do you think that we're a very open campus and an open institution?
I would say we're open, but judging from just the physical aspect of just observation, it's very shut off in multiple ways. Normally, you look at the cafeteria and you can just tell who sits with who, and that's just how it is.
All right, well, thank you for your time, Johnny. I'm doing a little video compilation of interviews about Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you've ever witnessed any racial discrimination or stereotyping or anything like that at Siena.
Unfortunately, I will have to say, yes, I've experienced a little bit. One experience I have to say is somebody one time came to me, not a stranger, but came to me and asked if I had, smoked weed or pot. And I questioned them why, and they said, well, because of my friends. And then they started naming off people, and of course all these people were, Black as well. So I think that kind of put me in like a little...
Yeah, they put you in a little stereotype that because you're Black, you've smoked weed before.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one experience I've experienced that's kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, so it still exists then?
Yes.
Do you think that we've came a long way since Martin Luther King?
I think we have a little bit, but it's like there's so many obstacles that's why the progress is taking such so much time to progress fully. So
do you think we'll ever reach utopian when it comes to racial barriers?
I'll have to say no, because I think there's still families and individuals that will still encourage racism and other things like that. Even though there are there may be a majority of people, there's still going to be the little individuals out there that
So you think that this roots from the parents then in the raising of the children?
Yes. Yes.
So if parents were educated a little bit more, then they raise their children to be respectful and not discriminate, be non-prejudiced, then you think that would help our society a lot as a whole?
Yes, completely. I believe that will.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
You notice any racism at Siena?
Not personally, I don't think I have, but there's one account I can think of, like some of my Black teammates, because I think racism goes both ways nowadays. And one of my teammates asked me why I talk so white, and my response was, I was kind of dumbfounded by the question because I didn't really know it was possible to act a certain color, you know, or not to. So I think that remark was a little racist, I think.
Yeah, it just shows how stereotypes are
Mhm.
still in play,
Yep.
and they're still current in our society.
Totally.
Do you think that we've came a long way since Martin Luther King Jr.'s day? You know,
I think we've come a long way, and at the same time, I feel like we haven't come that far. Because I don't think Martin Luther King would be,
content with where we're
yeah,
at.
content. I don't think he'd be very, happy with some of the way some of the things have gone too. So, for instance, there's a lot of black on black crime nowadays. You know, a lot of black people killing black people. So, I don't think he'd be too happy about that.
Even like some of the slang that they throw around with each other.
Yeah, I don't think no, definitely not. So it's kind of like taking a step forward, but at the same time, it's gone a different direction than I think he really planned on it to go. So,
Yeah, what do you think of that one? They call each other.
the N-word.
Yeah.
I guess I'm guilty of doing it too with my black friends, you know, because I do it a lot actually, more times than I even notice, you know. So overall, I think, you know, since I'm aspiring to be a teacher, I think it's inappropriate, but I think it gets thrown around a lot, like used in slang terms.
So you think it's more habitual than racist?
Yeah, I do. I do think that, definitely.
Anything else? Any comments on?
No, I think that's about it.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
So do you think racism still exists in today's society?
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of racism in today's society. You can see it. I know Morgan Freeman said that Black History Month is almost a thing that keeps African Americans apart. But in society today, it's just I think there's just a lot of things.
Do you have any specific examples from your college career?
I just think that in terms of the way that some students treat other students in class or outside of class, either way, there's no specific examples. I just think that you can just kind of see it.
It still exists.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think about the slang that gets thrown around by our peers?
If you're talking about things like the N-word, I don't like that specifically. But other than that, that's the really bad one. I don't even like it when black people say to other black people. It's not.
So do you think that this is becoming a hindrance to our society and us moving forward to try and break through these barriers?
Yes and no. I think there's sometimes when African Americans say it to each other, they're saying it in a different context. But I think there's an argument to be made for both sides. Where
So then it becomes more habitual than racist.
Yeah, for a black man to say it to another black man. But I think unless I'm given like full permission to say it to one person, I won't ever say it.
Do you think previous relations have a big role in how you use slang with other people?
Yeah, definitely. If I'm not their friend or I don't know them, there's no way.
Exactly.
And even when I'm their friend, I'll literally wait until they say, you can do this. I won't ask for it. I won't do anything. Like, they have to tell me.
What do you think that society needs to do to move forward with this whole issue of racism?
Just keep creating equal opportunities for everybody. I think that sometimes when people go affirmative action, there's a reverse affirmative action that everyone talks about, and there shouldn't be either way. It should just be you're good enough for a position, you get hired. You're good enough at a sport, you're on the team, things like that. It should always be like an equal opportunity. You're smart enough, you should be able to be whatever college you want to go to, things like that.
It should be based on ability
Mhm.
rather than looks.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, not that I know of. Just people here at Siena Heights and do a great job trying to get the word out about activities and things that are going on during Black History Month and try to really raise awareness about different things that have gone on in the past. So it's always good to see.
All right, well, thank you, Matt. Okay, so do you think that racism still exists in today's society?
Definitely. I think that I really think that no matter where you go, you'll always experience racism. Maybe not like you personally, but racism will always be prevalent, especially in like my generation and the generation above me.
Have you experienced any or witnessed any examples here at Siena, or just in your lifetime in general?
I would say, like, in my group of friends, we have 3 Haleys, and one way that they differentiate one of them is they call her Blackie, but the thing is that she's probably a quarter African American, and the rest is Native American and white, but because of her skin tone, like, she's known as the Black Haley.
Do you think we'll ever overcome these racial barriers?
Honestly, I don't think in my lifetime we will, only because I think since we've inherited some of our like qualities and the way we think from our parents, and they were so affected by it, I think that we'll continue to have racism in our generation. Hopefully in future generations, though, we'll be able to overcome it and get rid of it.
What do you think of the slang that is thrown around between our peers?
Like such as what?
Such as just derogatory terms like Negro or other words like that, because our peers will throw that around with each other.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I definitely think sometimes it can be stereotypical almost, because I know there's definitely a double standard a lot of the times that if a white person were to say Negro or something, like any variation of it, it'd be offensive. But if it's said within the African American community, it's almost acceptable unless it's not meant in a derogatory way. Even if the person who is saying it isn't black, it's still sometimes considered to be derogatory, even if it's not meant to be.
So do you think the stereotype is more habitual than racist? It just becomes a habit?
Yeah, I think so. I think we see that with a lot of slang that just becomes out of habit and not necessarily to be a racial term, but it's just out of our generation and the way that we decide to articulate words instead of using, maybe the proper word or a different form.
What do you think we can do to move forward from our racist past?
I definitely think we've made great lengths and strides, overcoming it. I think it's gonna just take a lot of teaching our children and educating those around us that slavery is done. They abolished that a long time ago. We can
In America.
in America, and we can we're moving on from it, and for there to still be racism, it's kind of pointless. We're all mixed in some way or form now. There's not 100% American. We've all came from immigrants, and I just think it's very almost stereotypical to say there's racism just for African Americans, because I know that you have to be able to realize that with discrimination there's all forms, and when you are, I don't really know how to say it, I guess you really just have to realize that it's done. And you have to move past it. You just put it in our past and keep it in our past, and understand that it was not the right thing to do, and learn from it.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so do you think racism still exists in society today?
Yes, I believe it does still exist in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's in the classroom, in the business field, in the prisons, I believe it still exists.
Do you have any examples that you've experienced from your life or you've just witnessed?
I really don't have any examples, but for instance, coming here this year as a freshman, a few of our freshman students actually told me that I was their first African American friend, which kind of put me through a loop to have gone through high school, middle school, and elementary school and not have come across a black friend.
What do you think about the slang that is thrown around between our peers?
I feel like I feel as if like the slang flowing around between our peers is a way that we just communicate with one another, but it kind of sets us apart from each other as well, as far as some groups of youth not knowing what the slang means, and then it kind of creates confusion within one another.
Do you think it's a double standard?
As far as double standard as
If a white person says it, if a black person says it to another black person.
sometimes it's taken offensive as if a white person says to a black person, yeah. So most people feel a different way about it.
Mm-hmm.
Myself, I don't let it offend me at all because I mean, it's, I don't know. It's like that's a hard question to answer. Let's see.
Okay, we'll back up a little bit. Do you think that if it is offensive or not depends on previous relations with the person?
Yes. Yes, because a friend could come out and say something, and it'd be perfectly fine. But if someone else, not known to the person, if they actually come out and say it, it could be taken as offensive.
And of course, the context that it's used in.
Yes.
So how do you think that we can move forward from our racist past?
Well, working in the diversity and inclusion office, we set up a lot of events to create diversity within campus and bring people together. And these events are held all throughout the year. So we try to get everyone to come together of every race, ethnicity, every different background, whether you're rich, poor, black, white. We try to get everyone together on the same page and create a real close, tight, unified community.
All right, well, thank you for your time, Jatisse.
All right, thank you.
So, do you think that racism still exists in society today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one really important thing that we need to think about is two things, really. One of them is that we've seen a shift in the United States from de jure or legal segregation and racism, in which racial laws across the country specifically targeted and identified people's race as a category for citizenship, as a category for rights, and access to education and health care. But we've moved away from a legal system of segregation or de jure segregation to de facto, where we have legal codes that do not specifically mention race and do not specifically identify race as a category for citizenship or rights or access to healthcare and education, but because of the structures and institutions we live with and the way that they are put together, race still remains an incredibly salient factor in individual and group dynamics. And I often point out to my students that it's really important to remember that a huge factor in determining people's ability to access education or healthcare or full civil rights is their economic status. And although it's not written into our laws at this point, as a nation, people's race and ethnicity can have a huge impact on their economic status. So people of color are disproportionately impoverished in the United States.
So that's feeding the stereotype.
A little bit. I think another really important thing to remember that I like to try to keep to distinguish in my own life and help my students distinguish is between individual prejudices and bigotry and systematic and institutional inequalities. So I don't think that I have any personal biases against people because of their ethnicity or their race or their religion. I certainly see people's race and ethnicity when I meet them and use it in the way I sort of make sense of them as a person, but I don't think I discriminate against them. But that doesn't change the fact that as a white man, the structures and institution of our economy and our political system provide me with privileges and access to resources that other people are denied. So I think it's really important to understand the way race and racism still operates in the world today. We have to remember to think about the ways in which it's not just about individual biases, but about structural and institutional biases and the distribution of resources.
What are some examples that you've seen here at Siena Heights?
One way I think to understand that is to think about school systems. Public schools in the United States, and now charter schools, because they take their funding from public school funds, receive their funding from property taxes. And 50 and 60 and 70 years ago, our real estate practices and mortgage loan practices systematically favored white neighborhoods. So white neighborhoods, property values were assessed at higher levels because it was assumed they were a safer investment for banks. Over time, this has led to a dynamic in which some areas have very high property values, other areas which may have same houses, just be a mile away, will have lower property values because 50 or 60 years ago of the racial dynamic in the neighborhood. The way that becomes inherited and passed on is that those property values influence the revenue that comes in through property taxes. So a house in Detroit could be valued at $50,000. A mile away in the suburbs in Oakland County, it could be $300,000 higher because of the location. Then the revenue generated from property taxes on those is much higher in the suburban area. And so those school districts end up getting more money. And that can lead to a discrepancy in quality of education for students. And that comes about through resources. The salary teachers are paid, and so the teacher's ability to do their job, and the individual attention the students get. I see that in the classroom in oftentimes, and this is a broad generalization, but oftentimes when I teach our English 100 basic writing class, students who end up in the test placing into a low-level English class more often come from underserved urban areas or very, very rural districts with no tax base. And the individuals who are in those classes are not in any way less intelligent than people who place into higher levels of English. It's simply that they come from school districts with much lower tax bases, lower property values, which leads to lower school funding, and so the education they get is not as strong. And that's one of the ways that it's most apparent to me in my teaching.
Okay, so we've come a long way, but how far do you think we've really come since Martin Luther King Jr.?
Oh, well, I think, on the one hand, 50 years ago, it was still illegal in much of the U.S. for people to marry outside their racial identity. So African Americans and whites couldn't marry each other 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, the vast majority of African Americans were disenfranchised, prevented from exercising their right to vote, largely because of poll taxes and other disenfranchisement policies, and also just through sheer intimidation. We now have a president who's the son of an African man and a white woman, and who wouldn't have been elected if African Americans and other impoverished people across the country hadn't been given the ability to exercise their right to vote. So on the one hand, I think that you have to see, President Obama's election is a really good sign that we're accepting of not just people of color and African Americans in positions of authority, but also somebody who's the product of, who's the child of a white person, an African person, and the changes in our political structures have enabled that election. But how far have we not come? Well, we still have vast economic disparity across racial groups. White people, on average, have 8 times the wealth of African Americans. Latinos and Native Americans have roughly the same, if not lower, average wealth per household than African Americans. We still have vast discrepancies in our educational systems. And, just to use the president as an example, there's still an awful lot of people in the country who really don't like the idea of a black president. So I think institutionally we still have a long way to go, and we still I think over time need to, it's going to take a very long time for people to be more accepting individually.
Do you ever see us completely overcoming these barriers?
Well, it's important to remember that it's not just a matter of, we can change individuals and individuals' minds and behaviors. We can also do everything we can to create, ensure equal access to services and education and healthcare and voting. But it will take a very, very long time to address the centuries of inequality that precede us. If I were not white, if I were born African American, given my family history, I never would have gone to college. My family had access to education because of our race that African Americans were denied. And so I think it's important to remember that that's nothing to do with me or the world I live within. It's everything to do with the centuries that passed before me. And it will take, I think, an extremely long time and concerted effort to redress really 2-3 centuries of inequality and unequal distribution of resources.
Okay. What do you think about the slang terms that is thrown around between my peers at the school?
Well, you know, that's a really sensitive thing, isn't it? I think that it's language is incredibly powerful and is something that is malleable. It evolves, and it's used, can be a powerful tool when used in certain ways. There are words that the N-word is a good example of this, that I won't use in the vast majority of conversations I have, because it's a word that has an enormously negative history attached to it, that when I say it, draws on that history and perpetuates it. Even if the people I say it to know that I don't think those things. Mm-hmm. Are there situations in which a word like that can be used? I think so. I think when I teach African American literature, poems we'll read or pieces we'll read that use it, where I think it's important to use. It's important to use it because the piece of art wants us to address understanding. And so I think that when you're in a setting in which you're engaging and analyzing a slur, I think that there's a use for it. Now, there are words that in certain social settings, I think that people use in a way that is can be powerful. I think to sort of take it away from a really, really sensitive thing, my brother and I both grew up playing sports, being fairly athletic, and we still like sports a lot. I teach English. My brother's an artist now. And if he were to jokingly call me a meathead or a dumb jock, I would understand, given the context of that conversation and the person from whom it was coming, that it was meant not in a strictly derogatory or critical way, that it was meant to, in a more playful way, in a critical way, in an insightful way. And so I think that we have to be careful about defining certain words as acceptable and certain words as totally bad, because there's always going to be settings in which those words can be, or their use allows us to think about their purpose and their meaning. And words evolve. Words evolve over time. You know, they change all the time, and I think the best thing that can be done is to acknowledge the power our language has, and take it on. So if it's a word that is got a problematic history, if that means not using it, that's what it means. But there's also lots of powerful examples of individuals taking ownership over a word that's been used as a slur in the past. And it's a sensitive word, but the word queer is one of those, where for some GLBT people, repossessing the word queer and owning it has been a powerful political move. 50, 60 years ago, it was the most common slur for gay men, but it's been reappropriated by some segments of GLBT community.
So previous relations with who you use that slang with is very important then.
You could say that, and understanding who the speaker is and where the speaker comes from and the place where the conversation's happening.
Do you think that many of these slang terms have just become habitual over time more than racist or offensive?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we're all, I think it's important to remember we're all human. And, I have a very strong memory of my sister, a couple weeks after my sister let our family know that she was in a relationship with a woman, jokingly, in her presence, without thinking what I was doing, using a gay slur to make fun of my brother. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, suddenly realizing, oh God, like I can't say, I shouldn't say that, and I know I shouldn't say it, and I really shouldn't say it, and then feeling very guilty. And it being that interpersonal relationship that made me rethink using a gay slur, and having to rethink the usage of that term and what it meant. Because prior to that, it had never been something that somebody could take personally. It had it had meant something very different. Or I wasn't aware it was something somebody could take personally, because I wasn't close to a person who would take it personally, who would be individually hurt by it.
Do you have anything else to add about Black History Month or racism in a whole?
Well, I think the question of whether, this is... it's an interesting question. It comes up every year. People ask, why do we have to have Black History Month? We don't have Jim Crow segregation anymore. And I think it's... or why do we need to pay attention to Black history? Why can't we just include it in American history? And the reality is that African Americans remain economically and politically marginalized in the U.S. And have less access to healthcare and education and voting rights. And those things are still constantly in danger. African American History Month, Black History Month is a really good opportunity to remind ourselves of both the very positive and the negative parts of American history, which you can never, I think, need to be remembered at all times. And I think that it's also a really important month to pay very close attention to who we are as a nation. African Americans constitute roughly 10-12% of American citizens, American population. It's not a huge part of our population demographically. There are more Latinos than there are African Americans in the U.S. But the centrality of African Americans within American political and social history and economic history, and the centrality of African American culture to American culture mean that we need to, I think, remind ourselves of that importance. The American Constitution, the American Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, and the great constitutional problems we've come to face, and the great social movements we've faced, the vast majority of them have dealt with African American history. So slavery, the end of slavery, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement are the moments where who we are as a nation were most substantially challenged. And then remembering, despite being a small part of the American population, African Americans' culture has had a dramatic influence on U.S. culture, and that's, I think, most felt in music. In that with the possible exceptions of country and bluegrass, pretty much every American musical form has a significant influence in African American music, and even country and bluegrass have those. Have African influences in them. But it extends beyond music to painting and to literature. African American History Month is a really good opportunity to remember the centrality of race to our national history and the important contributions African Americans, despite being marginalized citizens, have made to our nation. And the reality is that it needs that attention, because for the other 11 months of the year, or in a survey of American history course, there's so much else we have to think about and do think about, and to pay attention. This 1 month, I think, is important. And given our geographic location, I think the proximity to a city like Detroit, which is, in terms of the number of African Americans in the city of Detroit and the percentage of the city of Detroit that's African American, we are close to one of the largest black cities in the country. And given our geographic location, black history is essential to understanding where we are here in the Midwest.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creeds. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood